ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our last panel of the day, a long day, it's heat. Let me introduce our two speakers. I will begin with some words about each of our two last speakers of today, and after we'll listen to their presentation. Frederik Ponjaert will give us some comments, and after I will give the floor to the audience for some questions. So let's start with our first speaker, Professor Mitsuhiro Yoshimoto, who is a professor of media studies and visual culture at Waseda University in Tokyo. He will speak today about the cyber democracy or cyber populism, a crisis of political reason in contemporary Japan. Professor Yoshimoto has written a lot of books, especially books about, film, for example, about Kurosawa, a very famous director in Japan. And his last book is about some reflection about the 3/11 in Japan. So the disaster, the Great East Japan earthquake, and the book is co-authored with Christopher Tony, and the name of the book is Planetary Atmosphere and Urban Society After Fukushima. So a very, very diverse personality with a lot of different facets. In fact, our second speaker will be Professor Kazuya Fukuoka, who is coming from St. Joseph University in Philadelphia. He will speak about Japanese youth nationalism in cyberspace, memory, others, and the national pride. Professor Mr. Fukuoka is associate professor in the Department of Political Science in St. Joseph University in Philadelphia. He's teaching about collective memory, nation and nationalism, ethics in international affairs, IR theory, Japanese politics, and so on. He has published a lot of articles and book chapter, and he's working now on books about Japan youth nationalism, if I'm right. Okay, thank you. Let's go first with you, Professor.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for your kind introduction. Let me see. Japanese digital use can be either a simple or complex topic for critical discussions. We can examine, for instance, how digital technologies are used by a specific age group, normally categorized as youth in contemporary Japan. Such study is highly valuable for understanding of not only contemporary Japanese youth culture, but also the social impact of digital technologies on youth in general. As an alternative to empirical research, we can also scrutinize each word of the phrase Japanese digital youth separately in order to figure out what other issues are at stake besides the relationship between Japanese youth culture and digital technologies. When we take this second approach, our goal is not necessarily to come up with some kind of answer or a systemic interpretation of data, but to articulate critical questions that may not be too obvious at an initial stage of our inquiry. In my brief talk today, I'd like to analyze Japanese digital youth by making the following associations: Japanese with soft nationalism, digital with techno-utopianism, and youth with historical impasse. In order to explore the issues of techno-utopianism and soft nationalism, I would first discuss the Japanese critic Azuma Hiroki's idea of democracy 2.0. In the second part of the talk, I would extend my analysis to the question of historical impasse by taking up the idea of perpetual defeat proposed by the Japanese political theorist Shirai Satoshi. The meanings of the three terms, soft nationalism, techno-utopianism, and historical impasse, may not be too obvious at this point, but hopefully they become clearer through my analysis of Shirai's and Azuma's arguments. But actually, what I'm going to do today is, because of the limitation of time, I'm going to only talk about the first half of the first part of my paper. So I'm not going to, unfortunately, I cannot touch on the idea of historical impasse and the youth, even though they are quite important, but I hope I have another occasion to talk about them because it's going to probably take 35 minutes just to talk about the first half of the first half. Okay, so outside Japan, Azuma Hiroki is probably best known for his work on otaku culture and database consumption. In 2001, he published the book Otaku, Japan's Database Animals, the English translation of which subsequently appeared in 2009. The Japanese original of his second translated book, General Will 2.0, Rousseau, Freud, Google, which I would examine closely, came out in 2011, the year of the Great East Japan earthquake and the Fukushima nuclear accident. In this book on politics and database, Azuma tries to construct an updated version of democracy, that is, democracy 2.0, in the age of the internet and digital technologies, by reviving Jean-Jacques Rousseau's idea of general will as its foundation. Broadly speaking, there are two ways of conceiving democracy, either as a set of values or as a set of institutional arrangements. Although they are not mutually exclusive, it is important to keep in mind this distinction to avoid any unnecessary confusion. Azuma lays out his alternative political vision in relation to these two aspects of democracy, but interestingly, over 2/3 of his book is devoted to the institutional arrangement or architecture of democracy 2.0. Azuma is interested in exploring the possibility of an alternative model of democracy because there is a strong sense of disconnection between politics and the general public now. He does not find people's ideas and opinions sufficiently reflected in the collective decision-making process under the currently existing system of democracy. Where the typical reaction to such malfunctioning of democratic system emphasizes the need for voter education and the importance of deliberative democracy. Azuma claims the requirement of deliberation as a necessary condition for reconstruction of democracy is too high a bar to clear. This is because of, according to Azuma, widespread political apathy among people. Quote, "It goes without saying that people today are no longer interested in politics. It is not only that they have no interest in debating over individual policies, they are not interested in politics itself. Because the desire to consider society in its entirety has declined and the people have sequestered themselves to their own private interests. A healthy political communication that intellectuals hold up as the ideal is no longer being sustained," unquote. I find this an extraordinary statement to make in the book devoted to the possibility of politics in the contemporary world, but we'll leave it for another occasion to scrutinize his diagnosis of mass political apathy. In his political treatise, The Social Contract, Rousseau distinguished the general will from the will of all. That is, the general will consistently relates to shared interests, while the will of all is only the aggregate of private interests. Azuma finds this definition of the general will too abstract to be of much use in bringing democracy up to date, but still emphasizes its significance because it resonates well with digital technologies and internet culture. No matter how much the populace discusses things with one another, they cannot attain the general will on their own. Since people can express nothing more than their private interests and desires, their collective deliberation only result in the will of all, or so-called public opinion. Azuma claims that the general will emerges only when people neither discuss nor exchange opinions among themselves. But this makes the general will completely inaccessible to individual members of the collective because it does not exist in any tangible form. The articulation of the general will requires a transcendental being, the lawgiver in Rousseau's text, or many would not hesitate to call it a dictator, that has capacity to extract the shared interests from the desires and opinions of all people while preserving their differences. The general will may have been only an utopian or a dystopian idea for a long time. However, according to Azuma, with the invention of the Internet and Web 2.0, we now have access to the general will of the people and can use it as a foundation of a new democratic system of governance. Azuma claims the general will 2.0 is a form of collective intelligence, which is obtained by employing appropriate mechanisms to aggregate the diverse opinions of individuals, making dispersed and independent judgments. He argues that we have access to the general will in the form of a massive online database built on search engine, keywords, and SNS messages. The important point is that this database has nothing to do with people's explicitly stated opinions. Azuma writes, quote, "As everybody knows, Google users do not necessarily exchange opinions. All we do is type a word in the search box as we please, using the service of our own purposes. Nor do we express our individual opinions about the search results, stating that this one was worth visiting, while that one was worthless. Still, the collective will that emerges at the actions of each of us are accumulated and analyzed. The selection of search words, the history of page views, and the frequency of ad clicks constitutes a gigantic body of knowledge that has enormous influence on contemporary society," unquote. Even though SNS messages, unlike Google's search words, often express the user's personal ideas and opinions, Azuma finds no essential difference between them. He argues we need to pay attention not to the literal content of social media feeds, but to the use of particular phrases, styles of expressions, and other rhetorical features that begin to form recognizable patterns through a data mining process. These patterns constitute the unconscious desire of the people, that is, the general will, in the age of digital media and the network society. In Azuma's words, quote, "The general will is the database. This is the core of the discussion that will follow," unquote. Because of time constraints, I cannot thoroughly dissect Azuma's argument today, but still a few pertinent questions can be asked based on our discussion so far. That the ultimate purpose of democratic governance lie in the full realization of the general will? Does the crisis of democracy stem from the difficulty of inventing a specific political system that can actualize the general will through concrete policies of governance and legislative proceedings? Azuma's answer to the first question is yes, without a doubt. In his reading of Rousseau, the general will never makes a mistake because it is the general will that functions as the standard against which what is right or wrong is decided. Thus, if there is a way of perfectly realizing the general will or the unerring expression of shared interests of all people, that definitely qualifies as an ultimate form of democracy. On the other hand, Azuma's response to the second question is much more ambivalent. That is, he wavers between a full realization of cyber democracy and a hybrid compromise of representative democracy and a networked database. The last question we can ask before moving on to the next topic is, why Rousseau? Azuma writes, quote, "Rousseau was an author who was far removed from what we imagine from the words political or social thinker today, and was instead more akin to an otaku, to use a contemporary expression," unquote. I'm not particularly interested in making a judgment on the accuracy of Azuma's reading of Rousseau's The Social Contract, or his presentation of Rousseau as an otaku. We can leave it to political theorists and Rousseau specialists to decide if he is a good interpreter of Rousseau's work. A more intriguing question for us is whether Azuma's cyber democracy, based on his idea of General Will 2.0, genuinely qualifies as a form of democracy or not. Azuma only briefly discusses democratic values in the last part of the book in relation to the work of American philosopher Richard Rorty. Key ideas in Roti's theory of liberalism is that Azuma closely examines are irony and contingency. According to Azuma, if you believe in the universality of something, but at the same time acknowledge that the belief itself is something particular or contingent, your embrace of self-contradiction makes you an ironist in Roti's sense. This Rotian ironist is also a relativist who must acknowledge even the denial of relativism is valid. Azuma argues it is precisely this self-contradiction of ironist that constitutes the ethical foundation for liberalism espoused by Roti. What kind of political system then can actualize Roti's idea of liberalism? Given his embracement of absolute relativism, liberal society in its most ideal form cannot be based on any systemic sets of beliefs or ideologies, including socialism, communism, and even liberalism. Ideological conflicts can never be resolved through deliberations because truth is always relative and accidental. The only way of successfully maintaining social cohesiveness is to exclude all ideologies from a public realm. Azuma argues that in the liberal utopia envisioned by Roti, there are no ideologies or ideals of any kind. Obviously, there is a big hole in this model of liberal utopia. When taken to its logical end, relativism descends into a maelstrom of self-destruction. Liberal irony, which simultaneously affirms and denies its own truth value, may work as an ethical principle, but can hardly sustain liberalism as a political system. This is where imagination emerges as a pivotal concept. If liberalism is more than just an endless process of relativization, it needs a positive mechanism through which people with diverse opinions and backgrounds come together and form a coherent social body. According to Azuma, Roti finds the foundation of liberal society in people's ability to feel empathy for others' sufferings. Azuma writes, quote, "We humans will never abandon our prejudices towards others who are unfamiliar, nor are we able to discover an essence shared by all humans and to build fraternity upon its basis. But the power of imagination that humans possess generates sympathy for others who are suffering before our eyes and serves to turn them into us in many different situations. While people may not be able to share a certain set of beliefs or lifestyle, by empathizing with one another through particular suffering, we manage to go on living." Roti further adds that solidarity is not generated through asking, "Do you believe and desire what we believe and desire?" Rather, it is simple query, "Are you suffering?" That gives birth to solidarity. Humans cannot achieve solidarity through reason because all ideals are relative and deliberations are never-ending. Yet solidarity can be achieved through imagination. This is Roti's argument, unquote. Thus, from the perspective of liberal irony, it is not reason but affect that plays a pivotal role in construction of social consensus. Azuma claims his vision of democracy 2.0 would be an electronically augmented liberal ironism. Yet, as his own exposition of Roti's philosophy shows, liberal ironism by itself is not a sufficient condition for establishing democratic identity. It is also difficult to see any trace of empathy playing a central role in democracy 2.0. Nonetheless, there are at least two reasons why Roti is important for Azuma. One is the fundamental assumptions underlying his theory of democracy 2.0. One of the fundamental assumptions underlying his theory of democracy 2.0 is that language is not an essential component of politics. According to Azuma, it is not true that when a group of people wishes something, the aggregation of their desires always requires linguistic communication. In our society, Such aggregation is realized automatically when people use the internet and network digital devices without consciously articulating their desires in linguistic form. In Rorty's liberalism, it is not logical reason, but affective imagination that creates a sense of solidarity. Similarly, for Azuma, it is not rational communication, but a database of unconscious desires that ensure democratic solidarity. Although such a database has no direct connection to liberal ironism, the shared skepticism towards language as an instrument of communicative reason allows Azuma to present his Democracy 2.0 as more than just an inhuman system of governance devoid of any ethical foundation. Azuma also needs Rorty's idea of liberal irony to prevent Democracy 2.0 from coming apart at the seams. His theory of a cyber-democracy is fundamentally ambiguous, vulnerable to criticism that finds in Democracy 2.0 not a utopian dream of the general will, but a dystopian nightmare of total control. Take, for instance, the following remark by Azuma on the problem with the already existing system of democracy. Quote, "The issue we are currently facing has less to do with the government refusing to take up the wishes of the people than with a more serious situation where nobody, including perhaps the people themselves, knows what the people truly wish. We are currently in need of a mechanism to visualize what we truly need without the mediation of roundabout systems such as elections, hearings, and public comments, or the narrativization provided by media such as newspapers and television," unquote. The idea of government or state Azuma envisions in this passage can claim its infallibility because it knows what the people truly wish. Since the people don't know what they want themselves, the state has no need to take up the wishes of the people explicitly expressed by them. If the people still insist that the state listen to their demands, the state can legitimately repress them in the name of the people. What we just described is nothing more than a quintessential model of totalitarianism in the age of democracy 1.0. In democracy 2.0, however, the state is not under control of either a dictator or a massive bureaucratic apparatus, but virtually replaced by an all-encompassing database. What was only an ideological deception in earlier times is now becoming a genuine reality with utopian aspirations, thanks to technological advancement, or at least this is the story Azuma wants to narrate. But are we all convinced by it, really? Well aware of his vulnerability, Azuma sets up a few lines of defense against possible criticism of his theory. His first strategy is to emphasize the ideological neutrality of computer networks and data collecting systems. While acknowledging the possibility of these technologies being used for massive surveillance or commercial marketing, Azuma nonetheless insists that technology does not have any intrinsic ideological value. Quote, "Turning all of life into information, the society of ubiquitous documentation, to use our terminology, may indeed magnify corporate control of consumers, but on the other hand, it may also make possible a system of social welfare endowed with an unprecedented level of attentiveness. The birth of the society of ubiquitous documentation is an ideologically neutral change that can be linked to either market fundamentalism or social democracy," unquote. But arguing technology is an ideology-free instrument that can be used easily for two exactly opposite purposes, Azuma tries to distinguish his Democracy 2.0 from an updated version of totalitarianism. However, he does not seem to be completely convinced by his own argument because he also tries to downplay the role the database plays in Democracy 2.0 without necessarily denying the ultimate significance of technological advancement. In his modified model of Democracy 2.0, the people's unconscious is made visible by the internet and digital technologies, yet does not directly determine the policy of governance in a mediated fashion. Instead, he calls for a combination of deliberation and database to avoid a stalemate in endless discussions and at the same time to prevent the tyrannical reign of database. Quote, "No serious politician takes the time to lend a serious ear to critiques of politics spewed out on the internet by NEETO or unemployed youth. Until now, that has been common sense. Yet, the emergence of Google and the theory of collective intelligence teach us that important insights can be extracted from even fragmented utterances and childish impressions, if tens or hundreds of thousands of them are gathered together. That being the case, can we not consider implementing a system that releases to the internet all of these policy debates from behind closed doors, on the premise that the meetings themselves will be conducted by the experts and the politicians, but collecting on a large scale and visualizing as the limiting conditions of the debates the impressions of audiences viewing the live broadcasts," unquote. In this modified version of Democracy 2.0, the basic apparatus of representative democracy remains intact. It is not a database, but elected representatives and the professional elite who still hold closed doors anymore. The meetings they hold are always shown live on the internet, and the audience's response appear in real time on screens or monitors set up in the location of the meetings. As they read the audience's real-time comments and questions, the politicians themselves are forced to react to those responses one way or another. Asma argues the establishment of this feedback loop prevents a reversion to the impasse of Democracy 1.0 or a transformation of Democracy 2.0 into database totalitarianism. He summarizes Democracy 2.0's double-faced character as follows. Quote, "Deliberative democracy and database democracy. One idealism that thinks that if citizens really talked it out via the network, everything would go well. And another idealism that thinks that if we just build a giant database and collected a massive amount of data, then the rest will be collective intelligence yielding the optimal solution. A Kantian idealism that treats individual users as humans proper to themselves, and a utilitarian idealism that sees and processes the herds of users like a herd of animals. In contemporary Japan, Democracy 2.0 generally seems to call to mind one of these two. But the vision of General Wu 2.0, the theme of this book, is formulated as a combination of these two. Democracy 2.0 that this book projects arises where various oppositions, human and animal, logic and mathematics, reason and emotion, Hegel and Google, coexist by way of irony and conjoin." Unquote. This modified theory of Democracy 2.0 raises some serious questions about Asma's ideas of database, General Wu 2.0, and ultimately democracy. First of all, the system of instantaneous feedback loop he presents as an essential feature of Democracy 2.0 is now so routinely used by both mainstream and internet media. It has become a thoroughly familiar feature of a contemporary media landscape without necessarily letting us glimpse a bright future of democracy. In fact, according to Asma, what his book hopes to put forth is an extremely practical or perhaps commonsensical small-bore proposal that seems merely to assent to the change that is already occurring like a landslide. Yet it is not clear what this acknowledgement is supposed to prove, especially when we are learning the dire consequences of what Angela Nagle calls leaderless digital counter-revolution. Asma's reference to irony, which presumably derives from Rorty's liberal irony, does not change the fact that the modified version of Democracy 2.0 remains a variation of representative democracy. However, the most serious problem with the modified theory of democracy 2.0 lies in his claim that the real-time feedback loop allows the politicians direct access to the general will of the people. To repeat Azuma's earlier remark, the general will is the database. How does the database become the general will? As Azuma explains, quote, the collective will that emerges as the actions of each of us are accumulated and analyzed. The selection of search words, the history of page views, and the frequency of ad clicks constitutes a gigantic body of knowledge that has enormous influence on contemporary society, unquote. In terms of temporality, the database that comes into existence through collection and analysis of a massive amount of data, Timothy Morton would probably call it a hyper-object, is the exact opposite of a real-time flow of audiences' instantaneous reaction to what they are watching on regular or internet television. Whereas the general will as a product of the database requires time as a condition of its possibility, the feedback loop of high-speed networks eliminates time for the sake of immediacy. Azuma's two different definitions of the general will 2.0 as the database and as an ironic combination of deliberation and database are fundamentally incompatible, and consequently, his theory of democracy 2.0 lacks coherence. Azuma may or may not be aware of the serious contradiction between his original theory of database and the modified version of democracy 2.0 that he proposes as a preemptive response to possible criticism. But this theoretical inconsistency may not be too important for him because the modified version of democracy 2.0 is conceived only as a transitional compromise, not the final realization of his true dream. He predicts that democracy 2.0 will eventually realize all its potentialities in the future by transforming itself into a full-fledged architecture of governance in which a formal governance plays an absolute minimal role. Quote, in the future world, the feeling of compassion or care that ties people together is no longer related to geographical proximity, but instead dispersed into the world via the network. Throughout the network, residents of the future world will step out of the enclosure of their safety as animals and recover their points of contact with society. Meanwhile, the state church with managing the earth under their feet will become an infrastructure service, losing its political character if we follow Carl Schmitt's definition that merely seeks to distribute resources with efficacy. In the world 50 years or maybe 100 years from now, it will be the market, not the state, that will draw people out from their lives as animals towards lives as humans, unquote. In the techno-utopian vision of the future presented above, or here, the question of democracy no longer exists due to its natural extinction. Is Azuma's prediction of a global future, or is there something specifically Japanese about it? What kind of historical imagination underlies his vision of techno-utopia? What role does the youth, referring both to the actual young people and to a fetish image, play in that historical imagination? I'd like to explore these questions closely, but have to leave it to another time. Thank you for listening to my talk. I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Yoshimoto. Very interesting presentation, stimulating presentation. We will now move to our second speaker, Professor Fukuoka. You have the floor.
Thank you. So thank you for the nice introduction. It is great to be here, and I'm honored to share my study today. My study has been exploring the socio-political implication of collective memory and nationalism in Asia, particularly Japan, I have been looking into socio-cultural factors within the broader framework of the so-called sociological tone in our series. Can the member of a generation feel responsibility and obligation so as to make restitution for past wrongs that were committed before they are born? In the case of Japan, this is to question the cognitive connection between Japanese people's sense of nation and their perception about moral responsibility on Japan's militaristic past. Conventionally, scholarly research on Japanese nationalism largely takes state-centered approaches and exemplifies the conceptual complexity and historical development of the official mode of nationalism. Although this mainstream elite approach is theoretically implicative and empirically rich, it doesn't necessarily show the whole picture. Although it emphasizes elite identity politics, including political leaders' manipulation of the process of nation formation and the struggle among the official and or unofficial nationalist entrepreneurs. What is left relatively unexplored is a question of how ordinary Japanese people perceive their own nation. In other words, the field importantly overlooks audience or receivers in the process. Overall, the underlying analytical scope of my study largely lies in the reception of the cultural object. We don't remember the past alone. People remember the past as a part of mnemonic communities. This Durkheimian understanding is important as society maintains its communal ties by teaching new generations what to remember and forget. This also explains the sense of honor, shame, or even pain we feel from time to time in terms of our national history. Methodologically, the current research thus constitutes an attempt to restore individual subjectivity back into the study of memory and nationalism. That is, newspapers, TV programming, and textbooks tell us what communication and academic elites believe about the past. They do not necessarily tell us what ordinary people believe or how they feel about what they believe. Therefore, without knowing what individuals believe about the past, we cannot expect to know how social contexts affect collective memory and national sentiment. My presentation today, this is an extension of my recent study on Japan's youth nationalism that appeared in the journal Nations and Nationalism this spring. There will be 3 parts. First, I will start my discussion by referring to the allegedly widespread influence of revisionist historiography or neo-nationalist in the late 1990s and beyond, and its impact on Japan cyberspace as a northing ground of the former. Then, secondly, I will revisit my aforementioned article and discuss what I developed there on Japan's youth nationalism. In this conjunction, thirdly, I will discuss the new interview research I had this past summer. The question of youth nationalism in Japan are often associated with emerging influence of revisionist or neo-nationalist the discourse. The attitude of Japanese youth constitutes an especially important element of Japan's memory politics, as the issue of rising nationalism has become one of the most critical foreign policy agendas in the region, and it continues to haunt contemporary Japanese societies. So it is certainly true that the landscape of Japan's history problems or Rekishi Mondai greatly changed with the revisionist discourse in the late 1990s. This is a part of the systematic reaction to the underlying societal mood in the 1990s. Although this might be counterintuitive to some, by the mid-1990s, underlying master narratives in Japanese society had become the admittance and acceptance of war guilt, and official apologies were more acceptable and more self-reflection was encouraged. while the Japanese politicians still debated what constituted historical fact and truth, the Japanese public in the 1990s was already well aware of the importance of sincere apology. National opinion polls in the 1990s also consistently found majority opinions that agreed to offer a heartfelt apology to the Asian countries, and this had been continuously so in the 2000s. According to neo-nationalists, post-war Japanese history education became masochistic or jigaku-teki, and Japanese people lost pride in their nation. So the conservative camp, including conservative NGOs, media outlets, and politicians, advocate the renewed pride in nation and Japanese society, Japanese history. In that process, they try to reinterpret Japan's war behaviors, including the revival of the notion of Japan as an Asian emancipator and skepticism toward Chinese and Korean historiography on issues such as Nanjing Massacre and or comfort women. They also charged neighboring countries with using historical issues as diplomatic cards. More recently, anti-Chinese and anti-Korean discourses are more explicitly incorporated into neo-nationalist debate. Pertaining to the similar logic and historical understandings, their arguments are often more self-righteous and xenophobic. One of the underlying questions during my research this summer was about the issue of online nationalism or cyber-nationalism among the Japanese youth, including the question of how they perceive neo-nationalist discourse. As many suggest, cyberspace provides a nurturing ground for nationalistic discourse. Japan's cyber-nationalism or internet right-wingers are notoriously anti-Korean and anti-Chinese. They also oppose mainstream liberal media. Notably, the online forum 2channel or 2channel has been a greenhouse for the expression of digital nationalism in Japan. With more than 2 million posts a day at one point, the site is also called as a community of anonymous anarchy. It is important. The site has been one of the most influential vehicles for the anti-Chinese, anti-Korean narrative. It is important to point out that the popularity of the site does not necessarily suggest that the majority of the users share such anti-Korean and anti-Chinese sentiment. Yet, it is also clear that the site has been generating a subculture that supports historical revisionism. Again, in the context of Japan's youth nationalism, one of the underlying questions is how influential and pervasive the discourse is among Japanese youth. Also importantly, how do they perceive, internalize, and or reject the narratives? So my study tried to provide a nuanced understanding about the often expressed but under-examined view that strident form of nationalism has been emerging among Japanese youth. The current project is along with hermeneutic studies that focus on memories of individuals through the interviews of college students. So now let me move on to my recent articles on Japan youth nationalism. In this article, I tried to capture the nature of youth nationalism or the lack thereof among the Japanese youth. And explore and clarify a cognitive connection between Japanese youth's sense of nation and their perception of memory on and the moral responsibility about Japan's militaristic past. So what is the nature of youth nationalism among the Japanese youth? What are the sources of their national pride? How proud are they or not? How do the Japanese youth perceive the national symbols such as national flag, and how is it related to the sense of nation? Also important, again, how influential and pervasive is the neo-nationalist or revisionist discourse. As a total, I had 31 interviews. I 37 interviews. I conducted 18 interviews in 2006 and 19 interviews in 2009 at the same institution in Kyoto area. So what did I develop in this paper, and so what did I find? First, nationalism is generally deemed as an inconvenience, if not entirely taboo. And my respondents were very defensive when it came to their identification with Japanese nation. The college student surveys also showed that they had trouble finding the historical event or national honor, which was also observed in the interview data. We asked respondents to name 3 historical events in Japanese history which would arouse in them as a Japanese national, rather than a private individual, a sense of honor, esteem, dignity, and self-respect. The most frequently named events include the Japanese economy and technology, victory in international sports, and the post-war peace constitution. Remarkably, while these 3 events came up repeatedly in both 2006 and 2009 surveys, no response was more common than any single response. As we examined how the Japanese respondents came up with those items, 31.9% of the total respondents in 2001 and 33.6% in 2006 couldn't name even a single event that evoked pride. Also, 63.5% in 2001 and 57.0% in 2006 couldn't name more than one event of national honor. Those figures are still more intriguing when compared to the answers to the question asking to name 3 historical events of national shame, dishonor, or disgrace. Close to 85% responded to that question. More than 30% of the respondents named 3 events. 31.2% in 2001 and 37.3% in 2006. The most frequently mentioned historical events of national shame was Japan's war in Asia and the Pacific War, World War II. Second, Japanese respondents were well aware of Japan's past aggression in Asia and also highly critical of them. They also try to distance themselves from revisionist historiography and nationalist politics. Their love of nation does not necessarily preclude a critical reflection upon Japan's past wrongs. Theoretically, this questions the core assumption of social identity theories or in-group favoritism, which suggests that the high level of national identification is likely undermine people's willingness to accept negative information about their group's past. To admit the past wrongs would certainly infringe upon a universal desire for self-esteem. As opposed to this, Japanese interviewees were often very sensitive to Japan's past misconduct in Asia and also critical of them. In this context, one interesting trait found in the interviews was that respondents' apologetic confession of their strong sense of nation, as if they were obligated to play down, if not negate, their patriotic feelings. Given Japan's negative prior images embedded in post-war Japanese society, one may find it rather natural that students tend to be hesitant to express their nationalistic positions, although neo-nationalists would call it masochistic. My informants also mentioned that their sense of nation is weaker than others. At the same time, they are very conscious of the level of their patriotic sentiment and also sensitive to their own ideological positions. Third, in this very context, most of the Japanese interviewees emphasize the relatively apathetic nature of their national flagging, international sporting events, and maintain that those ecstatic events do not necessarily provide a place for the outburst of their nationalist expression. They also underscored a lack of specific political meanings embedded in the contemporary flag. Fourth, what was observed was Japanese respondents' superiority complex toward fellow Asian neighbors. By distancing themselves from dishonorable emotional flaggings by the Chinese and Korean people, the underlying narrative of Japanese respondents implicate their sense of superiority over Asian neighbors. Japan's superiority is often associated with alleged depiction of Korean and Chinese nationalism as irrational and emotional, which reminds them of pre-war state nationalism and the political usage of national symbols for mobilization. This notion reminds us of classic binary distinction between Western, read as rational, and Eastern, or emotional nationalism. While the former is regarded as a model, the latter is characterized by an inferiority complex which produces impatience and intolerance. It is also commonly understood that the other is captured as excessively emotional in its expression of national identities. That being the case, however, in my article, I also cautions against interpreting those interviewees' comments at face value. While interviewees may see themselves as relatively apathetic and their national flagging as apolitical, this doesn't necessarily mean that they are actually so. A neo-Durkheimian perspective would suggest those in the stadium, by flagging the Hinomaru national flag together and singing Kimigayo national anthem together, they're necessarily fixated in national terms. So they may think that they join international sporting event as fans, yet they are also united as Japanese. Although international sports may not make them nationalist, it certainly makes them national. So given the findings and discussion in that articles, it should be noted that the original interview data for that article was acquired in 2006 and 2009. However, the last 10 years marks the deterioration of Japanese public sense of affinity toward China and South Korea due to territorial dispute with both countries, the comfort woman dispute with South Koreans, among other things. So it seems imperative to capture current state of affairs in Japan, which led to a new set of interviews this past summer. I had three contacts, one university in Yokohama area near Tokyo, and two universities in Kyoto, Osaka areas. As a total, I had 31 interviews. I'm still working on the data. Each interview took more than 60 minutes, so that amount of work to transcribe them also requires more time. So this is my sort of disclaimer or excuse that I still need to go through and scrutinize each one of the interviews. In short, just like those the college students in my previous studies, most of my informants try to distance themselves from the ethnocentric, neo-nationalist or revisionist perspectives. They do recognize online nationalism and its anti-Chinese, anti-Korean narratives. However, they maintain that these nationalists do not represent them. Those who resort to hate speech and or online nationalism to a large extent in 2-channel and so forth, they are considered as different, unique, or perhaps special. Importantly, those informants, the college student, 18 to 22 years old of age, they are social media native or SNS native. They started using PC, internet, or social media early in their lives. Many are sensitive to the phrase digital and media literacy and emphasize importance of it. I'm not suggesting that they are necessarily so, but they believe that they are internet savvy, and many were very skeptical or even critical of the information they get through conventional media such as TVs and newspaper in general, and also internet in particular. More concretely, although still preliminary, there are three observations. Most interviewees feel that they are not responsible for the past, Japan's past wrongs in Asia, because they did not commit the crimes. This is a question of authenticity of actors. They do recognize, emphasize the importance of learning, teaching the past, and educate themselves and later generations. They evidently separated themselves from the past offenses by the Japanese military in Asia. Although this is based on the observation of 31 interviews, this is a clear departure from the past studies the colleagues and I similarly conducted in the early and mid-2000s. This is also different from my recent article I just discussed, in which interviews were conducted in 2006 and 2009. The 2017 interviews data show another stark departure from the past pattern. As discussed earlier, previously, it was rather easy to come up with a shameful event with a reference to Japan's militaristic invasion in Asia. Also, it was relatively difficult to come up with national events of honor. Now, it seems like both shameful and honorable events are not easy to come up. This is my second point. Some were rather skeptical of the very facts of Chinese and Korean claims, including the very factual claims about Nanjing massacre and comfort women. History programs to them are now heavily associated with the images of territorial dispute, which is considered as a political game. Each party, Japan, China, and South Korea, is entangled in memory politics. Many are critical of and try to political usage of history. Many were critical of and tired of political usage of history and the past. Many also maintain that the Chinese and Korean government, perhaps the Japanese government too, cannot be trusted. Another disclaimer of sort. When I say many and or most, I roughly mean a majority of the subject. So again, this is still a rough sketch. At this point, I'm still working on some the general point. However, the purpose of the study is not to accumulate statistical data and generalizable knowledge. Rather, I'm trying to elicit common features and maximize differences. So I need to work on variations and eliminate the vocabularies observable in my data. A bit surprisingly, as opposed to the result of recent national opinion polls where the sense of affinity toward China and South Korea is never favorable, the Japanese respondents' sense of Asia was more balanced in general. Many differentiated politics, international memory politics, from ordinary people. Images of Chinese tourists are not necessarily negative, although most recognize the criticism against their uncivilized manners as tourists visiting Japan. At the same time, some also pointed out that the media, news, TV exaggerated those bad images which amplified Chinese stigmas. They do not necessarily trust media. Some also emphasize importance of interaction for mutual understanding. Those who have a Chinese and Korean friend, they had a better balanced understanding about the stereotypes image of them. They also stressed the importance to differentiate politics from people. So concluding remarks. So more questions and answers probably. Although this is the preliminary observations and only through interviews, unlike our previous studies in 2005 and 2005, 2010, most Japanese interviewees now seems to feel they are not responsible for the past because they didn't commit the crimes. They do recognize and emphasize the importance of learning and teaching the past and educate themselves, yet they evidently separated themselves from the past offenses by the Japanese military in Asia. This also echoes Prime Minister Abe's 70th anniversary statement in summer 2015. Known for his sympathy for revisionist historiography, PM Abe explicitly denies intergenerational responsibility of current and future generations. So what does this suggest? Immediate question is this valid? Is a finding I just showed empirically substantiated? As a study at this point is based only on interviews data, maybe opinion surveys it seems to help, and this is a part of research design. Given that findings is supported, then the question is why the change? Why did the shift take place? What explained the shift? I'm thinking about 4 potential explanations. The vocabulary regret. In 2010, I discussed with Barry Schwartz in our chapter article that there seemed to exist in the late 1990s and 2000 public code that to agree to apologize for Asia was appropriate. We called it vocabulary of regret. So in 2017, it seems that this code is gone, or this code is weakened among Japanese, or younger generations. One may want to attribute this to individualism. They are not necessarily constrained by the communal code or tradition. They eschew or avoid societal conventions. In this conjunction, apolitical nature of current college student may be pointed out. As I discussed with the several scholars in Japan this summer about this, some suggested that contemporary students tend not to commit to one position, or they try to avoid a position per se. They are not engaged in philosophical, ideological questions. Something that does not have clear-cut answers. Remember that they are social media native. Instead, they prefer soundbite information or online summary of social political issues. Right? If you Google it, then someone explains to you. Thought, apology fatigue. Japan has been apologizing to Asia so many times. How many more times, or how long should we apologize? This is rather a shared feeling in society, as seen the several major national polls, recent ones. Finally, education. They simply put, they do not know much about historical fact in detail. They just couldn't tell if Japan should apologize. Especially, as discussed, memory issues have been overlapped by other more intensive or tangible political issues, such as territorial dispute, which are largely dismissed as a political game. So I'm not necessarily suggesting or talking about hypotheses or causalities. However, with those factors set in to lesser or greater extent, we may be able to show a nuanced picture about contemporary youth nationalism in Japan. Of course, we have to be very careful. We have to be careful about trap of cultural determinism and or trap of generational explanation. Again, this is a work in progress, and obviously I have more questions than answers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your very interesting studies. We are very curious for your next result and your next article. Yes. So I will give you the floor to Frederik Ponjaert, who will give you some comments maybe about the two presentations.
So far from an easy job, as there are two very stimulating and dense presentations. With the permission of the panel, I'll give a few general comments trying to link both discussions, and then maybe have one or two questions specifically for each speaker. Now, the first thing that came to mind as I listened and took note of both presentations, and bearing in mind the readings I had done on the works of both authors previously, you do have here a reflection on two sides of a long-standing debate on national identity, nationalism, and collective identity, whether in Japan or not, with a deliberative Habermasian sociological approach in the second paper, and a more structuralist, I'll come back to it on, but Rousseauian approach in the first paper. So an interesting point here is that maybe not exclusively, but in Japan as well, nationalism is being thought of in similar terms, or being discussed in similar terms as here in Europe, as we too, and in North America, face ideational identity issues and new questions of nationalism. So at least the discussion presented today did invite us to be very skeptical of any forms of Orientalism or essentialism about nationalism in Japan. And I would like to thank both authors for that. The other thing that I took from both presentations is how political science, political theory, political sociology is currently trying to deal with a dimension that we have been ignoring for a very long time, which is the emotional, the affect. And the affect is very difficult for political scientists to deal with. For a very long time, whether because of the rationalist traditions of either sociology or of the Enlightenment traditions, political scientists for a very long time, even when dealing with religious issues or ideational issues, have sought causality, consequentialism, and rational explanations. Both papers, both presentations try to tackle the affect of identity and of nationalism from, again, very different point of view, a Rousseauist structuralist on the one hand and a more Habermasian sociological on the other. And I would like to thank both authors as well for bringing in this dimension of the affect, which for us in thinking about nationalism in Europe, thinking of populism in Europe, is also one of the big monsters, Loch Ness monsters, we're trying to deal with. And it is through this lens of the affect that I would like to bring in the cyber element and the youth element and try to put forward my two questions for each author. I'll go in the counter order. I'll start with Professor Fukuoka with a first question about the point of internet literacy, or how savvy the youth considers itself on internet. I am, as you, prepared to trust and believe them here. But my question is more, how historically savvy are they? Thinking of your previous work on Japanese textbooks, and where you show very clearly that the audience, the consumer, the Japanese students, don't actually learn anything from the textbooks or don't really internalize the textbooks. You also show in your work how Japan does not teach what I would call a critical historical methodology. So my question here is, beyond the question whether they are internet savvy, are these students historically savvy enough to deal with these issues, especially as they start dealing with them in the cyberspace? If they meet 2chan discourse, do they have the means not to unpack the fact that it comes from an internet source, but to unpack the historical underpinnings? And this obviously brings a larger question of historical teaching, not just in Japan, but in many Asian countries. And inevitably, the difference with Germany, where beyond the question of apology, the relationship to historical blame or responsibility has also been a source of a deep rethinking of historical method and historical teaching in Japan. And do you feel that at least this move into the cyber, this move into the apolitical, is maybe a risk because we're leaving these people, these young people, unprepared to deal with these issues? My second question is on the issue of the mnemonic, the historical memory community, the Durkheimian, which comes up in this paper, and you expound it in more detail in other publications. And you very interestingly argue that it is difficult for Japan, for the Japanese, to build this mnemonic, or at least that the mechanisms are different from the traditional Durkheimian view. Part of it being that Japanese citizens, and especially young people, don't talk about this. So if the public space is not the place where they build their common history, their common memory, and the private space is not where they build their common history and their common memory, is cyberspace now where they build, or are we confronted with a purely fragmented society of isolated individuals? This brings me to the questions for the first speaker. In my question to the second speaker, you clearly hear that the notion of an apolitical public space at least inspires some form of skepticism on my part. The apolitical public space is a central element, if I understand correctly, from Democracy 2.0. Again, in another way, the same question for the first speaker: does this apolitical space not leave the society defenseless for two dangerous trends? One, what we've seen in the US, the more that the citizens become apolitical in the public space, hyper-politicized minorities, whether they be Trumpian or libertarian or progressive, can take over the public space. It presumes an apathy of all, and that presumption seems, in my sense, not even to be true in Japan, as we see nationalist movements organize themselves both semi-publicly, publicly, and privately. And by creating such an increasingly apolitical space, does one not leave the democracy, the society, open to manipulation, transformation, or at least, let's say, exploitation by those who do not subscribe to the apolitical? Which brings me to the last point, which is maybe the more fundamental question, which is a challenge one can make to any thinker that goes back to Rousseau, whether you then go through Hegel to Marx or any structuralist approach. What structures the society here? If I understand correctly, that which structures the society is not class, is not even identity or gender or populism. It doesn't even seem to be populism in even a positive sense, like move for Laclos. It seems to be a completely destructured society. What then is still society? Are we talking about a Thatcherite, there is no I in society, there is only I in society? Is this a hyper-liberal ideal in a certain sense? And is passive data sufficient? With a sub-question, said passive data in the narrative of Azuma is indeed potentially controlled by companies, because that is the case of the West. But what of China? I've had a short side discussion about it. WeChat and data is controlled by the state. So there you have the party, the state, and the data that are one continuity. Is that not the traditional totalitarianism sneaking back through the back door? And I'll keep it at that.
So maybe me? Thank you for reading my articles and other stuff too. So did you like it?
Yeah.
So the question is how savvy, internet savvy are they? Again, this is the work in progress, and I have been. I still have to go through each of the data, and but I have a genuine question of what is going on. I kind of hypothesized before that the survey in summer that because of this not anti-Korean, but the sense of China and sense of South Korea has been deteriorating for the last 10 years. So maybe that should have affected the way they see the memory and the nationalism. But as far as my interview data goes, it was not the case. So my question was, what is going on? What is going on? So as I mentioned, so I talked to several the professors I know in Japan. Also, I talked to you. I asked you this afternoon too. But so it seems like those but I have to be very careful about this generational account. Right? If generation difference explained everything, maybe it doesn't explain anything. But it seems like at this point, they may have some different kind of like the cognitive mechanism or like the way they process information. And one of the biggest reasons is that for the first time in the history, they are this social media native. And the way they, again, I mentioned that it seems like they don't commit to one position, or they try to avoid the position per se. They don't engage in philosophical ideological questions. So they need some clear-cut, like the answer, clear-cut, like let's say, the soundbite informations. So this may explain something that I'm thinking right now. But again, I have to go back to my data. So, short answer is I don't know. Yes, but I'm working on it. And I think this is a very important question. So this is a question. Also, what is the second question? I'm sorry.
Sorry?
Did I answer your question?
You answered the first question.
First question. So second question is...
maybe. You're equipped to face questions about history.
Their historical literacy. How sophisticated.
So this is also a surprise to me. So my previous research, those 2001 and 2000, the one with some other scholars, and also my that articles, the nationalism article, that data coming from 2006, 2009, they knew the history well. Even though my history textbook discuss that they don't learn from textbooks. In that, my history textbook articles, I was discussing the function of history textbook when it comes down to the nurturing the historical consciousness. But that article too, I show that the people, students learn from their families and the internet or TV back then. But now it's, so I don't know. So that's another things I have to figure out. But several the subjects just told me they can't decide if we should apologize or not, because I don't know much about it. So I know, according to the internet, there is two different kind of opinions, maybe extremes, but I just don't have the knowledge to judge this historical truth. So the formation of the memory community, mnemonic communities, I'm kind of skeptical. This generational continuity is very important when you think about to have the sense of historical responsibility about the past. So again, I have to see what what we do, and again, we will have the survey data. Also, maybe I have to do the more interviews later. I don't know, next year. So that's what I'm thinking right now. Thank you.
Okay. The first set of your questions and comments, I completely agree with what you just said. It's just very difficult to characterize the political sentiment right now in Japan as apathetic. I don't see it anywhere. There are all kinds of people having all kinds of opinions, and they are quite political. And so he wrote this book in 2011. he just published a new book. I haven't read it yet because I just wanted to concentrate on this particular book. But the title of the book is something like Philosophy of Tourists. So we should take that position, the position of tourist now.
Tourist.
Yeah. No comment because I haven't read it.
Okay.
But this is an interesting time to talk about Azuma because now, as some of you may know, they're going to be in a general election in a couple of weeks in Japan. And, the situation is quite chaotic. One party virtually disappeared. All of a sudden, everyone was really shocked. And so things are not going in the way he expected. Right? So now he is asking everybody on the internet that not to vote, abstain from voting. And he's collecting signatures. And very understandably, everybody is criticizing him on the internet and elsewhere. So the kind of theory he presented in this book has virtually nothing to do with what has been happening in Japanese society. And that's why I think what you just said is, exactly correct. And I completely agree to your, interpretation response. The second part, it's an interesting question because, so what structures the society? For him, it's Japan. This is a part I couldn't read. In other words, what he's going to do after explaining what democracy 2.0 is and so on, he somehow, in a very acrobatic manner, tries to claim that all the new features of cyber democracy actually exist in Japanese culture. So that now he's not simply adapting Rousseau to our contemporary situation, but he is trying to argue that we are going beyond this Western model of democracy, partly, thanks to the advancement in digital technology. So this advancement somehow enables us, meaning Japanese, to actualize the potentialities of democracy, which were not seriously discussed and considered in the so-called the West. So no, for him, the society is very firmly structured, and what creates a sense of structure is this, fantasy, fetish image of Japan, whatever that may mean. So that's a second part of the political discussion. But then it's related too, actually, to the question of history, because Azuma is not the only one, but there are so many others, literary critics, philosophers, art historians, and the political theorists. I mentioned Shirai Satoshi. I couldn't discuss his work today at all, but there is a strong sense of historical impasse. Somehow, they have very diverse political views. Some of them, liberal, thinkers. Some of them, Leninist. So politically speaking, they are a very different group of people. But somehow they do share one view on Japanese history, that is there is something fundamentally wrong with post-war Japan. And they have a different view on what the source of that, why there's something wrong with the Japanese society. And I think all of them are probably wrong. I don't have time to discuss it, why, but anyway, so they are so obsessed with this fundamental problem of post-war Japanese society, and they simply cannot get out of this bubble. And I think what's happening is that the memories of the Japanese past atrocities and other things, these are of course important, but much more fundamentally, nobody seems to be able to think Japanese history as history. Regardless of their political positions, right, left, liberal, conservative, anarchist, doesn't matter. So they seems to be completely trapped in this state of historical impasse, and I think that has something to do with this fetish image of the youth. If you are familiar with the Japanese culture, popular culture, whether it's a television drama, film, anime, comics, there's this unexplainable obsession with the youth, or more specifically, high school students. I don't really understand why everybody is so obsessed with high school students. And I think the image of the high school students, this image of the youth, has something to do with this sense of enormous historical impasse, inability to think anything historically, and the issue of the Japanese past atrocities and the memories of those events. I think it's just my hypothesis, but it's part of this much larger picture where nobody seems to be able to think anything in a real historical sense. So that's why I think so many critics, including Azuma, was so excited about this idea of the end of history, postmodernism in the late 1980s and 1990s, and Azuma was one of the most influential, the critics talking about the end of history and how, and again, why that would make Japan the most advanced country. I'm so embarrassed to even say this, even though it's not my idea, but yeah. Anyway, so what structured the society? I think for him, it's Japan.
Any question from the floor, maybe? Yeah, Pierre.
So I have Yoshimoto sensei.
Yeah.
Like just a small precision. I don't even know if it's a right question or not, but within the theory of this Azuma, there was this talk about the language, and it seems that within that theory, he looks at language only as performativity. So in philosophy of language, we talk about performativity of language in the sense that language is something that you can, that it makes you possible to grab something, to have something. But I think that if you go a bit more further, you can understand that basically this is a very narrow way of seeing languages. Language is much more richer than just the performativity. So I think that's maybe a place where you can enter the theory and says, your theory might not be working so well because language is not only performativity. There's all the things that we can talk about and we can say about languages. And the other point was the fact that saying that the general will through the internet would be like a database. which I think is right, but I don't think it's the only way to see in things. One idea, I'm going to talk about a concrete example here, which brings a debate, a democratic debate again, and basically is to having like, so it's another way to work with the big database that you were talking about, right? So, if, for example, you create a white party which has no agenda at all. The only agenda that he has is to vote what the people ask to vote on the internet. So, for example, at the Senate, like the white party produced a web page saying, okay, today we're going to vote about this, 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 and this. And then you ask citizens, go on the internet and vote if you want the white party to vote yes or no to that law, for example. And so in that kind of sense, you have an example where basically you can use internet not only as a database thing, but like a really interaction with the citizens and being interactive, directly interactive with the Senate, for example, and not being only a general of as database or something, you know. So I think that's also kind of a place that you can talk about the democracy 2.0 related to internet, which I don't think is in touch with this theory actually, and that's making me a bit feeling a bit. Is it the only way to approach the problem? There is not other way to approach the problem. So that would be my remarks basically. So maybe you have thought about that, you have wrote about that, or
language. Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, his idea of language is very narrow, and in certain sense, I mean, he's not necessarily interested in language per se, but his real target is, the reason, or rational, communicative reason, and he's not really, paying attention to very diverse dimensions of language, and probably he wouldn't hesitate to admit that himself. The second one. From his perspective, that's exactly what he does. Okay, I think he has developed this very, very interesting theory of a cyber democracy, partly because of his frustration with that kind of use of the internet in the democratic system. In other words, in Japan especially, it's nothing is happening. Even though politicians and others say now it's the age of internet, and now it's we have internet democracy and so on. But in fact, there are just so many different regulations, and you cannot do this, you cannot do that. So virtually nothing happens. And I think he is frustrated with the way the internet is thought as just another tool to be added to the currently existing system of democracy. So using the internet to make using internet for the purpose of directly voting on the website. For him, is not radical way of utilizing the potentialities of the technologies providing us with. That's his position. Yeah. Not necessarily that I agree to what he's saying, but yeah.
Bearing in mind the limit of the comparison, because you pointed out how intrinsically Japanese the vision is, in the sense that it's structurally embedded in a fetishistic vision of Japan, there is a political comparative politics thing that comes to mind now. Some people in European political science tend to compare Japanese political system to Italy's political system, which generally the Japanese don't like. But what they have in mind is the Democrazia Cristiana, so the period where one political party, the Christian Democrats, control the political system. And then, due to the end of the Cold War and specifically Italian reasons, the Democrazia Cristiana collapsed. And basically, since then, the Italian system has been in immobile flux, or in a situation of political inertia combined with hyper instability, which people would equate with a certain experience of Japanese politics. Now, after 20 years of inert flux, this has produced two things. One, Berlusconi, which to a certain extent was a proto-Trump, and two, a current political movement called the Five Star Movement. Yeah. And I do, listening to what you describe, the Five Star Movement reminds me a lot of an imperfect version of what Azuma is describing. The Five Star Movement is not a political party. They refuse to be a structured party. Every vote in the parliament is done on the basis of data crunching, data mining, and an online polling of all the members, but anybody can be member for free. And so this combination of some things you are describing from the data-based democracy combined with European notions of direct democracy, the whole thing with a little bit of Rousseau sauce thrown in there, with a little bit of Gramsci to make it sexy. Now, and Italian. The thing is, it's fascinating to see how horribly wrong it is going. So currently the Five Star Movement is not functioning in the way the utopia describes. One communication firm who controls the data has taken control of the party. So a communication firm in Milan that controls both the data that comes in and the data that goes out. And this is not a neutral data. It's a communication firm, a consultancy firm, that the group had to hire to manage the data. And so you have here a populist party that is increasingly becoming a traditional populist party with specific economic interest controlling the data and therefore the interests. So I know you agree, but there is an empirical case you could point at in Italy that I think would be at least challenging to the Azuma thinker.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
My question is on cultural products. In the Italian context and in other contexts, cultural products are generally seen as one of the antidotes to this data totalitarianism, whether they are movie, literature, books. But in the European context, these cultural products are often made in relationship to others, in relationship to non-Italians. For example, when you think about the big movies about German relationship to its history, most of them are actually not made by Germans. The Germans love them, they watch them, they learn them, but they actually watch movies made by Americans, by Italians, by French. My question is not part of the bubble also that the Japanese do not have the means, I just mean the way, platforms and the tradition, to talk about these issues with non-Japanese, with Koreans, with Chinese, but also with Europeans. It's very difficult for non-Japanese to discuss issues of democracy, of identity, of history, of nationalism with Japanese citizens, not with our fellow academics, but with Japanese citizens. Japanese citizens, also in education, are not trained to talk about these issues with non-Japanese, which cultivates this notion of the bubble, the sort of isolation. And I don't think that random anonymous data will break that isolation. Maybe cultural products could, but most cultural products in Japan are Japanese for Japanese by Japanese. And there, my question is, the cultural world, film, literature, is there not a greater willingness to bring in non-Japanese content?
My sense of my diagnosis is very, very pessimistic. on the front too, because if you look at the weekly, movie box office, top 10 list, for instance, typically, out of 10 movies, maybe 1 or 2 non-Japanese, and 8 or 9 are Japanese now. And when I think about the similar list in the 70s and 80s, probably the reverse. 7, 8 foreign movies, American, some European, some Asian, maybe 1 or 2 Japanese, and everybody was complaining that why so few Japanese movies, watched by Japanese audiences. But now, I don't know, they're just not many people are really interested in maybe anything.
Maybe they would be interested if there were good movies about Japan from the outside, but I don't see any.
Or about other things, not about Japan.
The same with the music. If any Japanese musician say anything remotely political, there's a huge controversy. He or she would forced to apologize to his or her fans. There is no overt, pressure from anywhere. The government, no. I mean, it's mostly fan-based, and somehow they become so upset. And so non-Japanese music, of course, there are many small groups of fans, everywhere, but they're not going to create any large, social, movement, but they're not going to make any large social impact. Yeah. And if you look at the titles of, say, any new American movies released in Japan, they are horrible. I think they intentionally eliminate any meanings from those original American movie titles.
And the translation.
Yeah, in translation.
Lost in translation.
Yeah. And it's not just lost, but I think it's deliberate.
Is that a new thing?
I think it's very new. Well, when I think about the Japanese titles of the 1960s and 70s American movies, for instance, they are quite good. Some of them are better than the original titles. But now, the opposite. Yeah. Either devoid of any meanings or just total nonsense. I cannot think of anything, right now instantly, but there is nothing political about this particular example. But for instance, the movie Gravity was Japanese title was Ungravity was something the opposite.
The opposite.
Yeah, the opposite. Yeah. So it completely destroys the central message of the movie. And they did it only because gravity doesn't sound good in Japanese.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, and another example is one of the space program movie which I can't remember the title, but about the Mercury program. Which was before the Apollo program, right? Because presumably nobody in Japan knows anything about the Mercury program right now. The Japanese title added the word Apollo, and there was a huge outrage against that title. So the distributing company finally decided to drop the word Apollo, but they didn't include the Mercury, of course. So they do all kinds of things without any regard to the content of the movie. So so going back to your question, I don't know, really.
History.
But you don't have to. You shouldn't believe me. I'm this may be a fake
Fake news.
Yeah.
Fake news. Okay, thank you very much. Any more questions, comments? No? Okay, we can move on maybe? Okay, I just want to mention two things. First, we will pursue our discussion about, youth, nationalism, internet, and so on in February, because we have a workshop. We will find all information on your website very soon, I hope so. And the second information, maybe more important, I invite you all to have a drink after this long day of a conference. Thank you very much for the presentation. Thank you.